Um, so I come to this book from having done a lot of work with craftspeople and having learned a lot from them, and finding it very difficult actually to explicate how they know and what they know. So it is from that place that I started my scholarly career. And I started with thinking about theorizing craft as knowledge after having worked with it as an economic product and livelihood. And immediately the questions that came, and they came from both sides, is that one question was, why do we need theory when we have practice and experience? And this is what people who are working with craftspeople said, we don't need theories. We have the practice and we have the experience. We have what we need. We don't need someone to come and tell us how to theorize this. And on the other side, the historians of science and technology said, we don't need craft. We've got science and technology. The time of craft is long in the past. And this already shows a kind of fragmentation of knowledge that is owned in words as science, in objects as technology, and in words as theory. So we made up these categories of ownership of knowledge, which is fragmented. And clearly there is also a hierarchy depending on which domain you're operating from. Now, as I said, you see cloth as an economic product. I work mostly with handloom weavers. So you see cloth as an economic product, but you can also see cloth as a knowledge product. And here, what I would like to point to is that what we are doing here is we are saying, one, the way you own cloth is as an economic product, and the way you know cloth is in a different domain. It's in domain of knowledge. So the second kind of fragmentation happens, that you know in one domain and you own in another domain. So then the question that would come from my colleagues was, why do we need to talk about knowledge when the real problem is marketing? We're not giving viewers livelihoods. We have to work on viewer livelihoods. So how will this actually, talking about craft as knowledge, do anything for viewers, and how does it relate even to owning that knowledge? So here I'd like to start with a small example that some of you might know of a very prominent designer, Sabyasachi, who took a quite popular motif from craftspeople in Sanganer and printed it digitally on mill-made fabric and sold it under his own brand to H&M. And there was a huge furor because people said that he was appropriating this product on one hand, this motif that belonged to these craftspeople on one hand. And there was also an accusation that he was not reimbursing them for it, while he said, well, actually, I made it completely differently, and it was not these people who made it, so I can't share my profit with them. And on the other side, there was this whole pride of people who recognized the motif as being clearly Indian, as culture, as heritage, and felt that Indian design was getting global recognition. So now the question that I come to is that this is a problem that we might think of as being the problem of artisans. But if you flip the problem, then you can also see that this is a site, this artisanal production is a site where you can really debate existing ideas of knowledge and ownership. It's a very productive site for actually scholars to start thinking in terms of where are these regimes working, how do they work, what keeps them up, and where do they break down. So at the heart of the question, therefore, of the Sabyasachi case is about ownership of the motif. And so it's a question of what is being owned, who owns it, how does the consumer own that knowledge, or of that motive? How does the producer own it? How does the designer own it? So this is really at the heart of that case. And it becomes very visible immediately that there is something unfair going on. But it seems that it is not within the grasp of science and law to actually rectify this unfairness. So at the core of my argument and of all the contributors to the book, and there are 12 lovely cases with the 13th chapter on how to read them, I think. At the heart is this, that when we make things, we are also making knowledge. Both things happen. The thing is being made, the object is being made, but while the object is being made, knowledge is also being made. So the idea of the book was to go beyond intellectual property. Now, this happened in a conference that I attended at Berlin, where there were a fairly large number of scholars who were pointing out how intellectual property is not, as we assume, naturally a universal regime that works everywhere. And there were cases from, ancient China, there were cases from contemporary India. There were all these different communities and cultures that own knowledge differently. And the idea of investigating knowledge ownership was to look at it historically. So not just at this current moment, look at it in other societies. On the other side, for my own interest, it was to draw on the knowledge that I had of artisanal production and compare these case studies and pay attention particularly to where knowledge is being owned as social relationship, as culture, as heritage, and how this somehow is not able, this kind of ownership eludes current intellectual property laws. So it was actually a kind of a way to answer questions from the field through a kind of a more scholarly analytical process of collective thinking. So these kinds of knowledges are very, very dispersed. Different people have different parts of that knowledge. Some people know the law, some people know how it works in other regimes, some people know craft. So the whole book was actually thought of as something collaborative, where everybody would bring their way and their regime of knowledge ownership to the table. And then we as editors would try and shape a kind of a analytical understanding that made us see how this kind of inequality was happening. So, so I start with the case that I know best, that I worked with a lot, which is indigo dyeing. And when I was trying to explicate the nature of indigo dyeing in order to make it visible as valid knowledge, at that point, the dyers that I worked with knew color by knowing the smell. So how are you going to make this kind of knowledge legible to science beyond describing it? And when you describe it, you actually don't know it because you don't know the smell. So it was this kind of difficulty that we were having. And there we kind of could see that there were these distinct ways that you could write it as a formula. That is, you could name it as indigo and, write the complex formula. You could even name it through songs about the blue god, because indigo is very much part of our, the culture of the way in which we live. And you can tell stories about blue. There are lots of stories, but because blue is also black, and there is this element of inequality, in a kind of in the caste system, which they could talk about using this color. So there was knowledge ownership. You could have knowledge about indigo through naming of words, in words, telling stories, telling songs. You could also know it in the performance of bodies. For example, Yellappa, the master dyer, could tell whether the indigo would be fast by smelling it. If it smelled a particular way, then he knew the vat is in good health and it can be, it will be good, the color will be fast. The girls who actually work the yarn in the vats, they count through breath. So they actually, it's a very meditative kind of atmosphere where they're all almost breathing together and counting. There are no numbers in the head. It's the number that's in the body. So you're performing the number in your body. And there is also a way of understanding. So there is a way of knowing through performance. I've said naming, I've said performance. And then there is a way of knowing through use, where you can actually know something only, it's something that is an object. The knowledge that you've inscribed into an object can actually be known only when you use that object itself. So for example, measuring cups. You can look at the cup and it just looks like a cup, but once you know how to use it as a measuring cup, then immediately it becomes an object of knowledge. So even within indigo dyeing, you could see that knowledge rests between all these performances of knowledge, which is naming, performance, and use. Now, to go to a more contemporary example, let's take an example of driving a car. So what is the knowledge you have to have in order to drive a car? You need to know how to read the words, because things have been inscribed into the gasometer, you have to read signs on the road. So there are things that have been named that you have to have the knowledge of. You actually have to have the knowledge of performance. You have to know how to steer, how to move the gear, how to look back, how to turn and reverse. That is the knowledge that you have to have in your body. And then you need to know how to use the things that have been inscribed into the car. You might not know how to make the engine, but you have to know how to use the knowledge that's in there by turning on the key. And you have to know, for example, that when you press the brake, the car will stop. You have to know the use of the brake. So as you see again here, I come back to this kind of way of knowing where, of course, you can name it. You can say, this is the brake, this is the steering wheel, but you also have to perform that knowledge, and you have to use the knowledge that's already been inscribed into the object. So there are these very different ways, and this acts for the individual, but there is also a collective element where we all have to agree that this is how we read this, even as we perform and use it individually. So in this book, what we do is we propose a way of understanding how knowing and owning knowledge are always together. So basically, this is not to say it is a semantic idea, but trying to say that when I say I have knowledge of something, I can't separate the having, which is the owning, and the knowing. So if I have the knowledge of your name, Kevin, I can't know it, but not have the knowledge. You see, once I have the knowledge of your name, I both know and own that knowledge. It's the same thing with singing. When I perform singing, at that moment, without having the knowledge of singing, I cannot sing, which means that I can't break open knowing and owning. So this is a very, very important part of this book that says, actually, when you have knowledge, you cannot break up and owning that knowledge. The second part of it is that when we as scholars or development workers or designers or practitioners break up and define what is it that is known, you are already fiddling or manipulating what can be owned. If you say it's the design that can be known, then you are already saying, well, the design is different from the actual structure of the making, and you've split it up, and therefore you can, by owning the design, you can own both the making of the weaver and of the designer. So there are these manipulations through which, by defining one, you're actually defining the other. Now, how then, if really having knowledge is something that happens, is always together, that we call it the knowing, the know owning. You know and own at the same time. then how is it that they actually come to be split apart? Am I going too fast? Shall I slow down? Do you want to ask any questions or clarifications at this point?
No, I think you're explaining it very well, and I'd have to also say that it's has a parallel difference between reading the book and hearing you speak. Is like
yeah, of course,
learning the instructions of the road and driving the car. So keep driving the car. You're doing very well.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we come to first intellectual property. So how, and this is the great advantage of using the domain of scholarship to understand these things, is that you don't immediately have to come up with, you don't have to take sides immediately. You don't immediately have to say intellectual property is wrong, craft ownership is different, we need alternatives. We can take a little step back and say, okay, how does this intellectual property actually work as an ownership, knowledge ownership regime? And this we call the science law regime. And at this point, I have to say that this coming up with this framework took a lot of collaborative work, because these things are actually so ingrained into our own minds that it's only when someone else tells you, look, you're falling into the trap again, you're splitting knowing and owning, or you're thinking of it as a kind of product and not as a process, or you're splitting up the product and process. Constantly we need to remind each other, and it's been a really nice experience to work with my co-editors as well as the people, the Vivek and Yon, who wrote the final chapter, to kind of simplify the framework into something that performs its knowledge and is usable. So this is the part where we got to, which is about the science law regime. Why does the science law regime work so well as an ownership, knowledge ownership regime? It works because actually it combines science as knowing and law as owning together. So it takes the fragments of knowing, owning, puts them together when you say science and law. And what works to fit them so well is that both science and both law use words and naming to both know and own. So if you want to know something in science, you actually have to put it down in words or a formula or an explication. And that's the exact same thing with law. If you want to write a law or you want to create a patent, you have to put it down in words. And so because both these use the same mode of knowing and owning, it makes it a very, very powerful regime in practice. The other thing that both of them do is they both treat knowledge as a product that can be owned as property. So when you invent something and you put it down on paper, the knowledge is now on the paper. The knowledge is now in the book. So you've turned it into a product. And what law then does historically is uses property law in order to decide ownership of that product. So science turns it into a product in such a way that law can treat it as property. And we have continuously, at least in the last 200 years within the science and law regime, used this way of actually expanding knowledge ownership. And what that does is that it becomes almost completely possible to separate science as being in the epistemic domain and ownership being in the economic domain. As if you cannot have ownership of knowledge that is epistemic, or that you cannot actually trade in knowledge in objects and bodies, or you cannot share knowledge through objects and bodies. So you've created these two very different domains just by treating knowledge as a product that is not an object, but it's been turned in through words, and it can be owned as property. And this is the sleight of hand. Something that we all know very well is not completely true. We know that not all language, all knowledge can be put into words, but still we act as if the only way to own that knowledge is if it is put into words. Thus, we are trying to argue that proliferating ways of knowing by saying, you can know as indigenous knowledge, as traditional knowledge, as craft knowledge. This is really not going to cut it unless we also proliferate ways of owning knowledge, and not just in response to um, uh, intellectual property, which is proprietary knowledge that can be owned, and its opposite as kind of commons. Because of course, craftspeople too want to own their knowledge as their own. They don't want their knowledge to only be in the commons. How are they going to get rewarded for it? That's what you see with the Sabyasachi case, that because the craft knowledge is culture and commonly owned, they can appropriate it with no problem at all. There is nothing legally or even morally stopping him from using their designs. So as I said, it becomes, knowledge has to be named in words to become valid as science, allows appropriation, because then the knowledge in bodies and objects no more counts. The person who's written it up becomes the owner of that knowledge. And it follows property law, which means that automatically any knowledge that is produced is traded as a product in the market, in the economy. And what this then does is that if you look at other regimes of knowledge where the science law or the naming and words are not dominant, those become less valid. So regimes of knowledge as instantiated in learning bodies, say of craftspeople, that do all things, that they name, they perform and use knowledge, rather than say that knowledge operates only in words and only as property can it be owned. If you have any other way than the science and law, that regime of knowledge ownership becomes less valid in our current times, and it fragments ownership of knowledge. So people who own knowledge through performance, through being able to use their tools, these people, you might even agree that they know. I mean, the worst case is that it becomes totally economic and you say it's labor. Even if you say, well, these people actually know, there is no way they can own it except as labor. They cannot own it as knowledge. And this is the critical point. So then to the question that Kevin asked, how does this really help craftspeople? How does the knowledge argument actually help craftspeople? And there, I think, if you think of crafts actually as a site where this problem can be examined, precisely because it is resilient, even against the very, very strong science law regime, then you can immediately see that there is still a lot of performance and use that goes on in the sharing of knowledge in craft. For example, how the cotton is grown, how the colors are made, what the weavers know, what designers can know and cannot know. This is quite, as long as it is commonly known in any craft product, we find that appropriation is that much more difficult. And how do you as a consumer or as a scholar come to know that and own that knowledge? You cannot only name, you also have to perform and use. So this places a demand on us as any kind of learners, not just scholars, to not use only naming, but also performance and use, and more important, not split them up, but work together with them. What if as a consumer, you came to know that a huge percentage of mass-produced textiles are actually incinerated, and the kind of wastage that goes on, and that the textile industry actually contributes more to greenhouse gases than the airline industry? What if you knew that there was an alternative? What would you know what do you know when you know that if you look at the fabric and you can tell when the cotton was picked, what kind of cotton it was, what is organic? What if you know these things, not because somebody has told you those things, though that could be one way, but not just that, but because you could see it, you could touch it, you could feel it in the use. So this is the kind of knowledge ownership we are talking about. And then the question becomes, what is happening in our world currently? What happens if you don't have that knowledge? If you're going to depend only on the naming, or you're going to split the naming and the performance and use and try and deal with them separately as knowing and owning in different domains. So that is one of the very, very relevant answer to the question, why do we need the knowledge question at all when it comes to crafts practices? And here I end finally, before I hand over to Vivek, that the role of scholarship is very important here. That scholars, when they pretend that you can know separately and own separately, that that science is about knowing and law is about owning, they're already manipulating knowledge ownership. And when knowledge ownership becomes unequal, it definitely becomes an unequal world. So I'm going to stop, and I want to see if Vivek wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Annapurna, for setting that up. If I may, I would like to just briefly share with you all some of the, how do I say, the practical outcomes or the forms that this discussion took through the course of making this book. So, for instance, when Dagmar and Annapurna put forth this idea, and then from the series of case studies or papers that emerged out of it, when we sat with this, with all of these materials, we tried to ask ourselves, how do we make sense of this to a broad audience of people? So not just scholars and historians, but also people who are active in the craft sector, could be even entrepreneurs and designers and so on. So if I may, I'll just quickly go through the process that we went through, and I'll just start with sharing a couple of slides. I hope you can see my presentation. Just to recap very quickly, as Annapurna mentioned, when we started going through these various case studies and forms of knowledge ownership, we found these dualities emerging. This is not a comprehensive list, but just a little hint or a sampler of the kinds of things that came up. For instance, the split between product and process, or between traditional and modern knowledge, or tacit or explicit knowledge, and between different kinds of labor, which are classified as intellectual or physical. And each of these contributed to particular forms of ownership itself, of that knowledge. So in this particular case, if we were to take the dominant regime of knowledge ownership, which Annapurna has just outlined, the dominant or the normative form is as intellectual property. So knowledge is seen as one more kind of property, or a commodity that can be owned through that. So the legal regime itself has to, this is the way in which knowledge is, or ownership for knowledge is made room for in our current legal systems. And as all of you are probably aware of, it takes these various forms, such as patents and trademarks and GI tags and so on. And the work that we do, so I work both with craft enterprises and with trade unions and cooperative societies. And from the field, we've seen many kinds of ruptures with these forms. So various kinds of artisans, various kinds of artisanal or craft practices have different sorts of problems with each of these forms. But outside of presenting a critique of it at the moment, we are still trying to find our way towards more workable and perhaps more equal forms of knowledge ownership. So what we tried to do in this book was to look at these set of 9 cases, these 9 chapters that we have, and contextualize them in terms of where they fall in the theoretical framework of knowledge ownership that we discussed earlier. So for instance, there are 3 domains and 3 practices, as Annapurna pointed out earlier. And whenever each of these intersects, it gives rise to one specific case. So in the end, those 9 cases resolve themselves rather fortuitously, I would say, into this sort of a grid that we use in order to demonstrate the terrain of knowledge ownership that we are covering. Each of these cases and the authors that have contributed have dealt with specific problems or specific areas of material practice that have given rise to those problems. And when we went through them, we realized that they were each contributing to populate one particular kind or to demonstrate one particular intersection of domain and practice for a given instantiation. So the instantiations are in the forms of words, bodies, or objects. So broadly speaking, words are in the domain of scholarship, in the domain of formulae, scientific explications, and so on. Bodies cover the realm of performance, of communities, of individuals, and objects finally are in the form of what are seen as artifacts or specific objects which reside in museums or in collections and so on. And when we mapped out these cases, we found that 4 distinct regions of knowledge ownership emerge, which are classified along the axis of being of the knowledge itself being on the spectrum from tacit to explicit, and the ownership being alienable or inalienable. I understand this that this is actually a rather dense slide, and I wish there was a quicker way for me to get to it, but I hope you'll indulge me in just bearing with me for one more minute. So what happens in this case is that in this analysis, in this particular kind of analysis, is that we found that specific cases, individual cases, could be classified into one of these 4 categories, where the ownership is either alienable or inalienable from the person who is, or the person or the persons who know, and the knowledge is classified as either explicit or tacit. Now, these are not the frameworks that the knowers of that knowledge in these cases themselves use, but rather these are the frameworks that are brought to bear upon them by outside actors when they come up, when they are seen as either knowers or as owners. So in the end, what we found was that the role of scholarship and more broadly of the legal and scientific process was to reduce many ways of knowing to one, in the sense that although the way of knowing itself continues unchanged in our present world, but in order to be recognized as one, to be seen as a legitimate one, it has to be explicated in a particular form. And so the case that we are trying to make now is that perhaps we need to understand how other kinds of knowledge ownerships or ownership regimes are perhaps necessary in order that they can be accommodative of these other ways of knowing. And with that, I'll end. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Vivek and Annapurna. And we open it up for discussion now. I'm sure many of you have things to ask, but if I can just jump in, I'm quite interested to think about the political implications of your framework, because to an extent it seems to fit quite well within a Marxist theory. The idea of the relation between capital and labor, and that capital abstracts labor in ways that suit particular interests within the class structure. And that industrialization, of course, then demeans labor in terms of serving those kinds of activities that are very routine-based and involve little skill, that the machines increasingly take over the hand skills that were there before. Therefore, labor becomes something which is fungible, which is easily transferable, becomes mere work. And I think now with artificial intelligence, we see this extend even into the intellectual sphere, where the machine is beginning to perform kind of mental functions as well. And within Marxism, obviously, the socialist movement was about workers' rights in terms of wage labor. And I'm wondering, in terms of craft rights, the value of this embodiment, this embodied knowledge. What is the sphere of contestation available now to be able to take your particular kind of opposition into political practice? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure. That's a very thanks, Kevin, for starting off with that framework right away, because actually that in order to understand, I mean, the minute you mention the word commodity, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the most how do I say, thorough explication of the commodity form, which is from Marx. And while it is true that the Marxist framework offers us a lot of tools to understand how we come to this position that we are today, in the world we are today. In practice, it turns out that, because also Annapurna's and my work spans both organizations such as trade unions, which emerge from an explicit Marxist praxis, as well as other sorts of collective forms such as cooperatives and so on, which are harder to classify in that sense. So what we found in practice was that the taking that on as the only way to understand this, for instance, treating knowledge in the commodity form, you get trapped in some kind of a dialectic where you end up with a reified form of knowledge itself, or of the knowledge ownership. And then that becomes very difficult to negotiate out of, because then we found ourselves trapped inside the logic of that dialectic. So then we had to many times step back from that in order to see, well, are there other forms of knowing and owning which do not necessarily fit neatly into a Marxist sort of historiographical understanding, which perhaps have something to offer to this debate. So in terms of political outcomes, while it may be tempting to say, well, let's move from, for instance, from individual to collective ownerships, or for instance, it's not so much like the sort of a Hegelian argument of saying, well, it's not so much what the thing is as much as in whose hand the control of it lies. While those are sometimes tempting options for us to consider, we do find that they are insufficient to accommodate the wide variety of cases that this book deals with, because the cases in this book span a period of about 1,500 years of human activity, and are from varied geographies, from Pacific Islands to Asia, to Africa and Latin America, and so on. So we find that if I may, just to summarize, while the commodity form is very useful to understand the present day, in order to understand a different politics, we do need something beyond a standard sort of a Marxist form here, and that's been our experience.
But what would that be? When you're talking, I think of the guild system, which is the European model for protecting this kind of practical knowledge, and for celebrating it as well, giving it value within the society. And within the Asian context, perhaps the the identity of master is one that embodies the knowledge in a particular person, and that the ustad or the sensei or the various forms that that's taken. Though, as you say, it's quite a variety of different forms that this takes. But in terms of the issue that you raised, Annapurna, in terms of what the benefit of this is, how might it be realized in terms of a practical action?
I think the first thing for me, at least with this argument, has been that the terms of engagement with craftspeople, my own terms of engagement with craftspeople, has become completely different. Because when I'm not dealing with craft knowledge as something that has to be, trained into dealing with current regimes of ownership. So I'm not trying to translate the weaver's knowledge into science. That's not my job. I'm not trying to protect the weaver's livelihood from the machine. That's not my job. First, I have to learn how to even engage with knowledge when it is being performed and used, not as some kind of mystical, intuitive practice, but as being extremely technological, except that that abstraction exists for the weaver in the material arrangements, alongside the material arrangements. The weaver does not generally separate the abstraction from the material. He's working with both constantly. And when I am engaged with the weaver and I engage either with the material arrangement or only the abstraction, I'm really not getting what the weaver is doing. For me, the minute I made that shift and that took a lot of doing, because that is not my understanding of knowledge. That is not how I know. And recently, our experiments have been very much in trying to see how someone who doesn't speak the knowledge of weaving in the same way that you speak it in words, how would you even begin to communicate? We start with a very basic problem. We don't know what the weaver knows.
Okay, anyone else is welcome to jump in here, but I just would put on the table the issue of attribution. Therefore, that the name of the artisan, which is not as an abstraction, obviously, but it's one that respects their personhood in terms of their skill, or it might be the village that, in terms of a collective. This is an issue when you look at collaborations between designers and artisans. Often the branding is the designer rather than the maker, which is perhaps seen as more like labor. But is attribution and support of attribution something that might respond to this kind of thinking?
I think the case that we are making is that attribution would still be about the naming. And how do you actually, and then again, you're in the science law regime, because you're already you're making subservient the other ways of having knowledge, which is through the performance and use, to naming. And then you've already lost the plot. Right. So with science and law, of course, that you can attribute but what we are arguing is that the subservience of performance and use to naming is the problem, both in knowing and owning.
Right, we're almost into the territory of Wittgenstein here in terms of whether you can actually ever get out of the practice of naming. But Patricia, did you have something?
Yeah, I did. I hope it's valid in the context of the discussion, but I'm interested when Annapurna talks about the ability to see if something's organic and it's handwoven, and through the eyes of knowledge, it makes me think of a custodianship isn't the right word, but if I think about the the time that I have to put into something to learn a practice it isn't just this kind of surface of how to, but it's also perhaps a caretaker role of how to ensure that the materials I'm using can continually be used as sort of a sustainability, and so some sort of connection between the process of making, and this could extend all the way to the process of using and owning. If you can't see it and you can't understand it and read it, because it's a sort of a time-based and experiential process to get to a point where you can, let's say, have a dialogue about something, regardless of what the words are, but you have an understanding of a process, but you also have an innate understanding of the performance of materials, or of how the materials are crafted to begin with, but you almost don't have the right to do the weaving till you understand how to grow and care for the cotton. This sort of, I don't know, right is again a problematic word. Custodianship is a problematic word, but I'm thinking of a sort of a knowledge system where it's an honor to be allowed to sort of participate in that next level, and that next level of caretaking is more. And that, I guess, is more from the perspective, of course, not more from a social kind of community perspective than a capitalist product oriented. But somehow things are getting more attached to their origin in ways when we have digital kinds of means to make those connections. So what we consider as communities to be appropriate or inappropriate or ethical, maybe, I don't know if that's what I'm thinking anyway. I don't know if that's offered anything, but be interested if Annapurna or Vivek has thought of it along those lines.
Yeah, what you say actually, it throws up a whole set of questions like this, of precisely the sort that you raised just now of, so for instance, is the division of labor, is the fragmentation of knowledge an outcome of the division of labor? Is it just a natural outcome that because all of us can't do everything, it's all right if knowledge remains in these fragments in that way, for instance? And one of the sort of slightly more eccentric forms that this takes is, you see a whole host of these, YouTubers and other, sort of video content creators who are sort of revivalists and back to the landists, who sort of go off to the bush or a jungle somewhere and start sort of reinventing civilization, so to say, right? And so, but what some of the cases in this book actually point to, though, is actually other possibilities. So, for instance, the idea of common knowledge, of knowledge that exists in the commons, even though it may not necessarily be something that you may yourself, like, for instance, maybe there is a particular textile that you recognize, which you may not know how to make yourself, but you can tell through a complex set of heuristics that you've developed, or through knowledge that's been passed on from generations. Like, for instance, my grandmother would be able to tell this particular kind of sari that was familiar to her, and she didn't have to rely on certifications or labels to tell. Now, so we have been interested in this idea of what happens when common knowledge is no longer common. So when that sort of knowledge is now seen as specialist knowledge. So perhaps the kind of knowledge that I'm talking about right now that my grandma had might exist with the curator of a certain kind of textile collection in a museum, for instance. Now that process is where we find when that sort of knowledge has been removed from our everyday social life, then we end up in places where people have to rely on, as Annapurna was saying earlier, on naming and other forms of explication, which are then prone to being co-opted by actors with a divergent range of interests. So the question is, what does it mean to go back to a knowledge commons without while still keeping the problems of attribution, of ownership that Kevin pointed to earlier, while keeping that in mind, is there a commons that we can all inhabit in a more equitable way? And perhaps those answers are specific. They're bound to be culturally and geographically specific, because the idea of the commons is extremely rooted in the kind of culture and sociability that each of us comes from.
Yeah, just to say that what you want to own individually and what you'd like to share may be completely different for different places. So it's not about whether something is in the commons or something is owned. It's about how you negotiate what you're willing to put in the commons and what you want to own yourself.
Monica, did you have something?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to, I think this is very interesting, and I think it's so important to emphasize in all discussions around different knowledge systems, and especially knowledge systems connected to craft knowledge, if you want, or traditional cultural expressions, if we attribute language from the legal perspective to it. This idea of knowledge as a process, knowledge that is not fixed, which is what the intellectual property system requires for a specific IP right to be attributed, is the fixation of knowledge. And when knowledge is not fixated, then there's these gray areas. But my question is, and I'm please correct me, I don't think I understood well. Are you, in a way, having this discussion whilst challenging the ownership paradigm, or are you within the ownership paradigm, not challenging the paradigm itself? And from this question derives my second question, because the commons is a concept that is not universally or internationally agreed as a definition. So most people define it by negation. So everything that is not protected by intellectual property law is in the commons, which is a challenge definition, which I personally don't agree with, because there's spaces where customary laws and knowledge systems that are alternative to the ownership, that don't even recognize the institution of ownership of knowledge, exist. So in many indigenous and local communities, there's different way of relating to knowledge. It can be, you know, this custodianship notion where it's a duty of care. It's a cross-generational transmission of that knowledge. It's almost seen as a connection to ancestors, as a cultural continuity element. It's not seen as property. How do these differ? This slight differentiators that from a legal perspective cause a lot of hassle, and I think it would be great to have this cross-disciplinary discussions to try to find a point, because what we also get all the time at the Cultural IP Rights Initiative, so we don't propose a property regime. We are looking at these alternative regimes that are coming bottom up, that are self-governed, so that this right to self-determination of communities and the way they relate to knowledge. I think Kevin mentioned a few different models, and what's very dominant today when we have this discussion is everyone jumps in the ownership regime and they say, no, but you cannot, because that's not copyright, like all those tools. So it's about leaving all those tools aside and, starting the discussion, how do we listen so that we can design a system that is created by the people who are, for a better word, custodians, stewards of that specific knowledge. I think I divagated a bit from the question, but the point was, is the theory challenging the ownership regime, and what's the role of these different knowledge systems?
Annapurna, would you like to start, or should I?
Start, and then I'll see if I want to say something.
Well, thanks, Monica. That's terrific, actually, and you're sort of getting right to the heart of this. So the thing about, so if I may, I'd like to begin with the last thing you said about listening. And I think that's actually where we began as well. So the approach that this book takes is to sort of sharpen our listening, if we may. So which is to say, well, there is always a temptation, a strong urge to move quickly towards a solution. But before understanding the entire the true nature of this problem and its very multi-dimensional sort of existence, it's hard to kind of come up with solutions that are both fair and that might have some kind of universal applicability. So beginning with the listening and the self-determination, as you said it, personally, I think a lot of my inspiration for this kind of work comes from how I have seen the historical progression in the queer and in the feminist movements. So for instance, that links to your first question of challenging the paradigm. So when we are faced with something that looks extremely solid and dominant as a normative form, including things like, for instance, gender, the idea of gender or of the patriarchy and so on. There are ways to challenge. I think we owe it to ourselves to be able to find different ways of challenging them, because there is no one way that can work across space and time. So to answer your question about challenging this paradigm, yes, this book and the approach definitely takes issue with many of the dominant frameworks of the current time of ownership. But equally, while doing so, we would not like to, take them as, give them so much power as to make them seem normative for all of us forever. In the sense, many times, like you rightly said in the second part of your question, if you define yourself in negation to something, that is a severe challenge to creating one's own identity, because you can't create your identity out of a negation of something else. So while we challenge the paradigm, we are consciously trying not to reify it so much that it becomes like as if we have to define every other way of owning and knowing in relation to that. We want to say that, well, there are ways that are absolutely ununderstandable to this current paradigm, and which can only be understandable when you start to listen, as you rightly say towards the end. And then your idea of the commons as negation is an extremely powerful sort of articulation, because that is something we come up with all the time. For instance, even in India, the very definition of handloom, what is handloom? In the Indian legal code, the handloom is defined as that which is not woven by the power loom. This is the standard definition that we have in this country, which, by the way, claims itself to be the largest number of working handlooms in the world. So this is very indicative of actually the severity of this problem of the definition by negation, which is also almost a systemic and endemic quality to ownership dialogues in our sector. So maybe Annapurna can say more about that.
You said it very nicely. I agree.
I wonder, before we finish, whether Ben or Laila or Serafina or anyone else has something to add. Ben made a nice comment about Monica's contribution. Ben.
Yeah, and I was excited by the conversation, excited by the way that it sort of pushes on our the dominant knowledge, as Vivek just pointed out. I feel somehow that the schematics that you showed is something that we could spend quite a bit more time on. I would have loved to hear about how you define unalienable, as a concept. And I'm wondering too, at the basis of your of this investigation that this team is sort of leading, what is the benefit of thinking about knowledge always back in terms relationship to ownership? And I'd like to see how that concept of ownership, as I think has just been said, to be more nuanced than it has been in this conversation. I feel that knowledge is something that you've described in many ways. You've leaned on tacit knowledge, which I think is very much part of the conversation and will be part of the conversation for craftspeople who've looked to Heidegger and to phenomenology to think about, how we know things. And I think this seems to be one of the core elements of your investigation. I know much less about ownership, and I'm interested in sort of seeing this concept, which seems to be sort of fixed, even though it seems to be describing different things in the way they've been using. I would have loved for these words to be more explicit. What do you mean when a weaver owns something that they make? What does that exactly describe? A right to trade, ownership on the design forever, and so I would have loved basically for this conversation to last for another couple of hours and for us to have time to dig into that a bit more.
Yes, Laila.
And first of all, thank you so much, both Vivek and Annapurna. I think I actually read some of what you had written. Kevin had shared it, and I found it really enlightening, and it has helped me shape my thinking. So thank you. I think that already is a huge plus in the sense that you're helping people see what they hadn't seen before. So thank you. And I think to me, though, the issue really is that there is a world order that is very difficult to challenge. And we might make some small steps at the local level, but to change mentalities and ways of, these are values that have to be changed almost. And I think I don't see any easy solution. So that, that's one point. I just have an article I read recently, which I thought was really to your point, at least to me. It was about sushi chefs in Japan, and how in order, like the best sushi chefs, you need to earn your place at their table. They will not allow you as a client if they feel that you're not worthy of the knowledge that they are putting into their craft. And I thought that was so beautiful. And in a way, if the whole world was like that, there would be a much more equal relationship. And again, the power relationship is much more equal when the craftsman and the consumer are, both, it's an exchange. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thanks, Laila. And I should note that Laila is a guest editor of the issue on the sense of smell, which is coming up in Garland magazine on the 5th of September. And I noted the issue of the smell of indigo that you made reference to, Annapurna, smell being something which seems to resist naming. In particular, I know that some people, like noses in the perfume trade, can use a language perhaps similar to wine tasting in terms of notes, but it seems a very approximate kind of thing. And to an extent, what you've presented perhaps gives a purpose to the whole project of this series with Garland magazine of the sensorium, how it is that, as you say, we need to sharpen our listening, to open our senses of smell and touch, to be able to understand and appreciate those forms of tactile knowledge that you're talking about. And while naming as a form of abstraction has obviously played a key role, but also the visual as a form of abstraction is one that's dominant in our world as well. So obviously in the design world, in particular, where patterns can be abstracted. So perhaps in terms of understanding and appreciating those other forms of knowledge, finding ways of honing our senses can be very useful. So anyway, thank you so much, Vivek and Annapurna, for driving the car with us and helping us navigate the various signs in our way, and for everyone else for wonderful discussion, which obviously seems like just the beginning. And to set things aside. Serafina, did you have something finally you wanted to say?
I have to ask, what next? I mean, the book is a manifesto of sorts. So what are the plans for the coming revolution?
You have to come and see.
Where? Come where?
Hyderabad.
Okay.
So we
When?
are. You have to earn your place at the table. No, we are. That's exactly what we are working on in terms of we were all part of this project called Penelope, which is about weaving in ancient Greece. And there is a very important action of Penelope's when she is weaving the shroud, which she weaves by the day and unweaves by the night in order to buy time. And I think we come back to the idea of how can we buy time? We really need to buy time. And maybe what we need to be doing is unweaving. So not what next, but maybe just what.
Right.
Like
Indeed.
undesign. We need to undesign all the stuff we've designed to take
Yes.
care.
And reinvent the wheel over and over again.
Yeah,
Certainly.
exactly.
Boom, boom.
Okay. On that note, we'll meet you again.
Yes,
Hopefully.
thank you so much. Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.